The illusion of peace in the early weeks of December 1944. The Western Front was characterized by a deceptive, almost haunting stillness that lulled the Allied High Command into a state of dangerous complacency. The Ardennes Forest, a jagged landscape of dense timber and narrow ravines spanning the border of Belgium and Luxembourg, was considered a ghost front, a place where exhausted units were sent to recuperate and green. Untested divisions were initiated into the rhythms of trench life. Intelligence reports, filtered through the optimistic lenses of Supreme Headquarters, suggested that the German Wehrmacht was a broken machine, capable only of a stubborn retreat toward the Rhine. This systemic failure of imagination blinded the Allies to the fact that Adolf Hitler was preparing one final, cataclysmic roll of the dice, gathering 3 full armies in total radio silence for a strike intended to split the Allied lines and seize the port of Antwerp. The Screaming Eagles awakened while the Allied leadership debated post-war borders. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, were enjoying a rare respite in Mourmelon, France, after the grueling battles of Operation Market Garden. Their rest was not just a luxury. It was a necessity for a unit that had been decimated by months of high-intensity paratrooper operations. They were light infantry, designed for vertical envelopment, not for sustained defensive warfare against heavy panzer divisions in sub-zero temperatures. When the alarm finally sounded on December 17th, it wasn't a tactical deployment. It was a desperate scramble. Soldiers were tossed into open-back trucks, many without winter overcoats, some still carrying nothing but their jump knives and a handful of rounds, as they raced toward a Belgian crossroads town they had never heard of, Bastogne. The strategic importance of Bastogne to the uninitiated, Bastogne was merely a quiet market town, but to the German planners of Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, it was the linchpin of the entire offensive. 7 major roads converged in the center of the town like the spokes of a wheel. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of armor and fuel across the entire Ardennes sector. If the German 5th Panzer Army could seize these roads, their path to the Meuse River would be unobstructed. Conversely, if the Americans held, the German offensive would be strangled by its own logistics, trapped in the narrow, muddy tracks of the surrounding woods. The 101st Airborne was not just fighting for a town. They were fighting for the valve that would either permit or prevent the total collapse of the American line in Europe. The atmosphere of the encirclement by December 20th, the steel trap had snapped shut. The German 2nd Panzer Division and the Panzerlehr Division had bypassed the town to the north and south, effectively severing all ground links between the 101st and the rest of the American forces. The weather, a vicious cocktail of freezing fog and relentless snow, became a German ally, grounding the massive Allied air fleets that usually dominated the skies. In the foxholes surrounding Bastogne, the Screaming Eagles found themselves in a nightmare of sensory deprivation. The fog was so thick that German Tiger tanks would materialize out of the gray mist only a yard from American positions. Every sound, the clank of a tank tread, the snap of a frozen branch, carried the weight of potential annihilation as the perimeter began to shrink under the pressure of constant probing attacks. The psychological toll of isolation is the most potent weapon in a soldier's psychological arsenal, and the encirclement at Bastogne was a masterclass in mental attrition. The men knew they were surrounded. They could hear the German loudspeakers through the trees, promising them warm food and safety if they surrendered, contrasted against the screams of the wounded in the town's makeshift basements. Medical supplies had vanished within the first 48 hours. Surgeons were operating with butcher knives and using cognac as a substitute for morphine. This was the darkest hour of the American combat experience in World War II, a moment where rational calculation suggested that the 101st Airborne would soon join the list of destroyed divisions. It was within this vacuum of hope that the narrative shifts from a story of a siege to the story of a gamble, as the focus moved hundreds of miles south to a man who lived for the impossible. The gathering of the Allied giants on the morning of December 19th, 1944, a cold, gray light filtered through the windows of a drafty barracks in Verdun, France. This was not a meeting of subordinates, but a council of war called by General Dwight D. Eisenhower to address a crisis that threatened to undo years of Allied progress. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the palpable tension of high-ranking men who knew they were losing control of the battlefield. Eisenhower, usually the diplomat, bypassed all formalities. He stood before a map of the Ardennes, pointing to the deep bulge that now threatened to reach the Meuse River. He framed the disaster as a great opportunity, but his generals looked at him with skepticism. They saw the reality: 10,000 men trapped in Bastogne, a crumbling front, and a winter storm that had neutralized their greatest asset, the Air Force. The strategic impasse and the southward problem, the problem facing the Verdun Conference, was one of physics and logistics. To save Bastogne, a massive force had to strike the southern flank of the German advance. However, the only force capable of such a move was General George S. Patton's Third Army, which was currently facing east, deeply committed to its own bloody offensive in the Saar region, over 100 miles away. In the rigid world of military doctrine, moving an entire field army, comprising hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks, and nearly 250,000 men, required weeks of planning. The staff officers present believed that by the time Patton could disengage, pivot, and travel through the icy terrain, Bastogne would have already fallen. The experts in the room were calculating a defense that conceded the loss of the 101st Airborne. Patton's audacious intervention, then, George S. Patton spoke, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift. When Eisenhower asked how soon he could launch a counterattack with 3 divisions, the room expected a request for 10 days, or perhaps 2 weeks. Patton's reply, the morning of the 22nd, was met with a stunned, almost mocking silence. It was a claim that defied the laws of military movement. Patton wasn't just promising to fight. He was promising to perform a 90-degree tactical pivot with 200,000 men in the middle of a blizzard. To many, it sounded like the typical bravado of a man who loved the spotlight more than the truth. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He had already instructed his staff to begin wargaming this exact contingency days before the meeting had even been called. The internal mechanics of the pivot, the genius of what Patton proposed, lay in his staff's Omega-level logistical foresight. While the rest of the Allied command was reeling from the shock of the German breakthrough, Patton's G4 logistics and G3 operations officers had been working in a fever dream of maps and fuel consumption tables. They had identified 3 distinct routes that could support heavy armor in winter. They had pre-positioned Red Ball Express fuel trucks and established traffic control points before the order was even official. This wasn't just a general's whim. It was a masterpiece of industrial-scale synchronization. Patton knew that his 4th Armored Division was the lightning Eisenhower needed, and he was prepared to burn out every engine and exhaust every man to prove that the Third Army could move faster than the German Wehrmacht could react. Eisenhower's ultimate command gamble. Eisenhower faced a choice that would define his legacy as Supreme Commander. He could play it safe, retreat to more defensible lines, and allow the 101st to be erased as a necessary sacrifice to save the rest of the front. Or he could put the fate of the war in the hands of his most volatile and difficult subordinate. Eisenhower knew Patton's flaws, his ego, his mouth, and his recklessness. But he also knew that in the history of warfare, there are moments where steady leadership fails and mad genius is required. When Ike gave the order to proceed, he was essentially gambling the survival of the American presence in Europe on Patton's word. The meeting ended not with a handshake, but with a grim understanding. If Patton failed, the Allied coalition might never recover its momentum. The logistical symphony of the Third Army, the moment Patton stepped out of the Verdun Conference, the theoretical plan transformed into a Herculean feat of industrial-scale movement. What followed was perhaps the greatest logistical achievement in the history of modern warfare, the Great Pivot. Over 133,000 vehicles were put into motion across a landscape choked by ice and decimated by artillery. Patton's staff had to reroute 250,000 tons of supplies and coordinate the movement of 6 full divisions, all while ensuring that the units already engaged with the enemy could disengage without being overrun. This wasn't merely a march. It was a high-speed extraction and redeployment conducted under the cover of night and the shroud of a relentless blizzard. Thousands of military police officers stood at frozen intersections with flashlights, guiding the endless convoys of the Third Army as they turned their backs on the Saar and pointed their steel toward the north. The agony of the frozen foxholes while Patton's tanks roared northward, the situation inside the Bastogne perimeter had reached a point of absolute desperation. The screaming eagles were no longer fighting for glory. They were fighting for the sheer right to exist in a world that had turned into a white void of fire and ice. Without winter gear, men wrapped their feet in burlap sacks and huddled together in foxholes to prevent freezing to death. The German artillery, possessing the high ground around the town, rained down a constant drum fire that splintered the frozen pines into deadly wooden shrapnel. Ammunition was so scarce that paratroopers were ordered not to fire until they could see the whites of the eyes of the German grenadiers. The perimeter was shrinking, and with every passing hour, the doomed status of the 101st Airborne felt less like a prediction and more like an impending reality. The nuts response and the psychology of defiance. It was during this period of maximum darkness that one of the most iconic moments in military history occurred. On December 22nd, a German surrender party approached the American lines with a written ultimatum: surrender or face total annihilation by heavy artillery. When a message reached the 101st acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, his initial reaction was a succinct, "Nuts." When told he had to provide an official reply, he scribbled that single word on a piece of paper. This wasn't just a colorful anecdote. It was a critical psychological pivot. By treating the German threat with such casual derision, McAuliffe infused his exhausted troops with a renewed sense of purpose. The message sent a clear signal to both the Germans and the men in the foxholes. The 101st would not be erased. They would have to be killed to the last man. The viciousness of the German counterpushed the German high command, stung by McAuliffe's defiance and aware that their window of opportunity was closing, intensified their efforts to liquidate the Bastogne pocket. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with the symbolic value of the town, diverted elite SS panzer units to the sector, ordering them to crush the screaming eagles at any cost. The fighting transitioned into a series of brutal, small unit engagements in the outlying villages like Neuville and Marvy. German King Tiger tanks, nearly impervious to American light anti-tank fire, prowled the outskirts, systematically demolishing the stone houses that served as American strongpoints. The weather remained a cruel mistress, keeping the Allied air forces grounded and ensuring that every yard of ground was paid for in blood, rather than airdropped ordnance. The ticking clock and the human cost of delay by the night of December 24th, the clock that Eisenhower had watched so intently in Verdun, was nearing zero. In the town of Bastogne, the makeshift hospitals were overflowing with men who had no bandages, no heat, and no hope of evacuation. The smell of gangrene mixed with the scent of cordite in the freezing basements. Patton's lightning was moving, but to the men in the snow, it felt like a ghost story, something promised but never seen. Every time a soldier heard a distant rumble, he hoped it was Patton's 155mm guns, only to realize it was another German barrage. The tension was no longer tactical. It was existential. The 101st had held for 5 days against impossible odds. But as Christmas Eve settled over the Ardennes, even the most optimistic paratroopers knew they were down to their final clips of ammunition. The faint hope of a clearing sky as Christmas Eve bled into Christmas Day, 1944, a sliver of hope, as fragile as a winter icicle, finally appeared over the Ardennes. The relentless fog and snow, which had for days provided an impenetrable ceiling for Allied aircraft, began to dissipate. For the besieged troops in Bastogne, the sight of blue sky, even if fleeting, was a psychological balm. It meant the possibility of resupply, of air support, and a symbolic connection to a world beyond their frozen hell. Simultaneously, high above the battlefield, Allied transport planes, C-47s affectionately known as Goonie birds, were already loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and food, patiently waiting for the signal to fly. This break in the weather was not just a meteorological event. It was a divine intervention that offered a fighting chance, even as the ground battle reached its most desperate pitch. The onslaught of Christmas Day, despite the clearing skies, Christmas Day brought no ceasefire. Instead, it ushered in some of the fiercest fighting of the siege. German commanders, acutely aware of the dwindling time they had to crush the Bastogne pocket before Patton's relief force arrived, launched massive, coordinated assaults. Panzer divisions, supported by infantry, slammed into the American perimeter from multiple directions. The Germans were no longer probing. They were committing everything they had, knowing that the capture of Bastogne on Christmas would be a propaganda coup of immense psychological value. American positions, already weakened by lack of sleep, hunger, and dwindling ammunition, held on with a grim, almost suicidal determination. In some sectors, hand-to-hand combat erupted as paratroopers, out of bullets, used bayonets and trench knives to defend their frozen foxholes. The resupply, a lifeline from the sky, the clearing weather, though brief, proved decisive. In a spectacular display of airmanship, waves of C-47s streamed over Bastogne, often flying at dangerously low altitudes to ensure accuracy. The sky bloomed with hundreds of parachutes, red for ammunition, green for medical supplies, white for food. To the starving, wounded, and exhausted men below, these parachutes were quite literally manna from heaven. This resupply was a tactical godsend, immediately replenishing desperately needed rifle rounds and artillery shells, allowing the defenders to sustain their fire against the relentless German attacks. More importantly, it was a profound psychological boost. It confirmed that they had not been abandoned, that the world knew their plight, and that relief was indeed on the way. The 4th Armored's grinding advance meanwhile, the spearheads of Patton's 4th Armored Division, the lightning he had promised, were battling their way through the final, brutal miles toward Bastogne. Their advance was a grinding, agonizing push against determined German rearguards and the unforgiving terrain. Every crossroads was a potential ambush, every village a fortress. The snowdrifts were chest-deep in places, and the icy roads turned tanks into skidding, vulnerable targets. The roar of their engines and the clank of their treads, though still distant to the men in Bastogne, with a sound of hope approaching. The 4th Armored was an elite unit, hardened by combat in France, and their tank crews and infantry, fighting as tank infantry teams, understood the desperate urgency of their mission. They knew that thousands of American lives hung on their ability to breach the German lines. The "We Are Through" moment. December 26, 1650, the final, climactic breakthrough occurred on December 26, 1944, at precisely 1650 hours. After days of relentless fighting, the lead elements of Combat Command B, 4th Armored Division, under the command of Colonel Creighton Abrams, smashed through the German lines from the southwest, making contact with the beleaguered defenders of the 101st Airborne. The first American tank to roll into Bastogne was a Sherman named Cobra King, followed closely by a column of supply trucks loaded with vital provisions. The scene was one of raw, unfiltered emotion. Exhausted paratroopers, their faces gaunt with fatigue and covered in grime, emerged from their foxholes to greet their liberators. News of the breakthrough immediately raced back up the chain of command, culminating in General Patton's legendary phone call to a weary Eisenhower, "Ike, we are through." This single, triumphant sentence signaled not just the relief of Bastogne, but a pivotal turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. The tactical aftermath and the cost of victory, while the breakthrough of the 4th Armored Division on December 26th broke the encirclement. The battle for the Ardennes was far from over. The narrow corridor opened by Patton's tanks remained under constant German fire, and the Bulge would not be fully flattened for several more weeks of bitter, attritional fighting. However, the relief of Bastogne had fundamentally broken the spirit of the German offensive. Hitler's gamble had relied on a swift collapse of Allied morale and a slow, bureaucratic response. Instead, he encountered a wall of airborne defiance and a counterstrike of unprecedented speed. The cost was staggering. The 101st Airborne had suffered over 2,000 casualties, and the Third Army had paid a heavy price in armor and men to open the road. Yet, in the silent, frozen woods, the remains of burnt-out Tiger tanks stood as monuments to the fact that the Wehrmacht's final resurgence had been stopped cold by American resolve. The complexity of the Eisenhower-Patton dynamic in the quiet rooms of Supreme Headquarters, the relief of Bastogne forced a profound reappraisal of General George S. Patton Jr. For years, Dwight D. Eisenhower had managed Patton like a volatile chemical, extremely powerful but prone to dangerous explosions. The slapping incidents in Sicily and Patton's frequent political gaffes had nearly cost him his career. Yet, as Eisenhower looked at the updated maps, he was forced to concede that Patton possessed a singular, indispensable quality, an aggressive operational tempo that no other commander could match. The letters Eisenhower wrote in the aftermath of Bastogne reveal a man who had made peace with Patton's flaws. He realized that while steady generals win battles, audacious ones save wars. The bond between the two men was forever cemented by the realization that Patton had delivered on a promise that every other military mind in Verdun had deemed impossible. Bastogne as a symbol of national identity, the story of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne quickly transcended the boundaries of military history to become a cornerstone of American national identity. The image of the screaming eagle in a snow-filled foxhole, refusing to surrender despite being surrounded and outgunned, became the definitive symbol of the American soldier's resilience. It was a narrative of the citizen soldier outfighting the professional Prussian war machine through sheer grit and individual initiative. This legacy was not just about the victory itself, but about the refusal to accept the inevitability of defeat. For generations to come, the word Bastogne would evoke a specific brand of American defiance, serving as a reminder that even when the weather is foul, the supplies are gone, and the enemy is at the gate, the spirit of a determined unit can alter the course of history. Historical reflections on the Great Pivot. Modern military academies and staff colleges continue to study Patton's 90-degree pivot as one of the most brilliant operational maneuvers ever executed. It is cited as a masterclass in command and control, demonstrating how a clear vision from the top, combined with empowered staff officers and superior logistics, can overcome the friction of war. The movement of the Third Army proved that the American military was not just a slow-moving industrial giant, but a flexible, high-speed force capable of complex maneuvers under extreme environmental stress. Historians often debate what would have happened had Eisenhower chosen a different commander, but the consensus remains. Patton's unique blend of ego, drive, and tactical foresight was the only key capable of unlocking the trap the Germans had set in the Ardennes. The 4 hours that defined an era in the final analysis, the entire saga of Bastogne, from the first truck ride to the final phone call, was a race against a clock that nearly ran out. As Eisenhower later reflected, they had made it with only 4 hours to spare before the 101st would likely have been overrun by the sheer mass of German armor. Those 4 hours represent the thin margin between a historic triumph and a catastrophic massacre. The legacy of the relief is found in the intersection of two very different types of courage: the static, immovable bravery of the paratroopers in the snow and the dynamic, restless aggression of the tankers on the road. Together, they prove that impossible is merely a word used by those who lack the will to change the map. The relief of Bastogne remains a testament to the fact that in the darkest winters of human conflict, the right man in the right place can indeed perform a miracle.